Hello, everyone. My name is Terrance Evans. I am a partner at Duane Morris LLP, where I serve as the co-leader of our banking and financial services practice, and also the co-chair of our diversity and inclusion program in San Francisco. I'm also honored to wear a few different hats. I am the president of the Charles Houston Bar Association, which is the oldest Black bar association in California, with roots going back to 1910. I'm also Deputy Director of Region 9 of the National Bar Association, and I'm the co-chair and co-founder of the California Lawyers Association Racial Justice Committee. I also have the honor of serving on the board of the California Lawyers Association as a representative of the litigation section. I prepared this presentation regarding Juneteenth to raise awareness of the history that preceded Juneteenth and also the history that followed Juneteenth. I've had the honor of giving this presentation to several different audiences, and I decided to record this so that I could share it with others who are interested in learning more about our history. I'm now going to share my screen and provide a few slides that will create some context about the Juneteenth holiday. So this provides just some preliminary information about Juneteenth and the various organizations that I have the honor of being affiliated with. This next slide shows what many states were doing about a year ago. This was May 13, 2021, in banning critical race theory. So the discussion that we're going to be having today about Juneteenth and all of the information that we're going to learn about events that happened before and after is banned in many states across the United States. And going back to May 13 of 2021, as reflected in this map, there were 14 states that had passed laws banning critical race theory, banning the discussion of the contributions of people of color to our great country, the contributions of members of the LGBTQ plus community, and going beyond that to also banning access to this information in public libraries. I continue to speak to organizations all across the country and throughout California. And in June 14 of 2021, on that date, I had the honor of speaking to employees at the UC Berkeley Law School about Juneteenth. And on that date, there were 21 states that had passed laws banning or were in the process of banning discussions about critical race theory, and more importantly, the history of our country as it relates to people of color and members of the LGBTQ community. We're going to fast forward to October 22nd of 2021. By this time, I had given numerous presentations on diversity and inclusion issues, racial justice issues to a variety of organizations. And on October 22nd, 2021, I had the honor of hosting the Bar Association of San Francisco's annual citywide diversity and inclusion program. It was actually the 9th annual citywide diversity and inclusion program. And as of that date, 28 states in the United States had passed laws banning the discussion of critical race theory, banning the discussion of the contributions of people of color to this country, and also the institutional racism that many of these folks faced in our country. Fast forward to today. Today is June 16, 2022. There are now at least 34 states that have passed laws that in some way limit the discussion of what some folks have termed critical race theory, or more accurately, the discussion of the contributions of people of color, members of the LGBTQ community, women, and even beyond. Many of these laws are so restrictive that they are now banning books and access to information in public libraries, so that folks on their own accord would be able to go and learn about this information. So as we prepare to celebrate Juneteenth on June 19th, it's important to understand that there are many places in this country, if you are a public school teacher, in some cases, if you're a university professor, or if you are a state employee, where these types of discussions are banned, prohibited. And the access to this information about some of the painful history of our great country is being completely denied. As we move forward with our discussion, we're reflecting on what is Juneteenth. So specifically, Juneteenth is celebrated on June 19th. It marks the day in 1865 when a group of enslaved Black people in Galveston, Texas, finally learned that they were free from slavery. It's important to keep in mind that this was nearly 2.5 years after President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which ended slavery in the South, not in the North, but in the South. This is both sad and happy. And I say that because it's sad that it took 2.5 years for these enslaved Black people to learn that they were free. We have to keep in mind that back in the 1860s, there was no internet, there were no fast means of transmitting information. So a lot of this had to be done manually with people representing the United States government traveling to plantations across the country to inform people, Black people in particular, that they were free. But it was also a happy time that they finally got the information. It is not surprising that slave owners did not have a vested interest in informing their slaves, their enslaved Black people who were working without compensation, that they were free. They had a vested interest in keeping them ignorant so that they would continue to labor without compensation. I think it's important to take a moment before we look further into the Juneteenth holiday to understand the history of racism that resulted in there needing to be a Juneteenth. So there are some historians that cite 1619 as the beginning of slavery in what ultimately became the United States. However, this is incorrect. There are many other historians that have been able to trace the origins of slavery in what we call the United States dating back to 1539. Slavery arrived in present-day Florida in 1539 when a slave trader and Spanish explorer named Hernando de Soto attempted to establish a permanent settlement and claim more territory for Spain. We don't have a lot of information about what the lives of these slaves were like when they arrived in what ultimately became Florida. We do know, however, that many of them came from Northern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. Some of them were deserted after they arrived here. Some of them left to go and live with Native Americans. Others who were sick or injured were left to die. These slaves were critical to building the infrastructure in what is now Florida. And it's important to understand that beyond this, slaves generally helped to build this country. They built the White House. They built much of the infrastructure that was essential for the functioning of the government. And they did so without any compensation at all. It's unfortunate that these great Black Americans have not gotten the credit for their contributions to building our great country. Most of the slaves, many of the slaves who arrived here uh, in what ultimately became the United States um, were given the opportunity, and many but not most, to convert to Catholicism when what became Florida was under Spanish control in exchange for their freedom. However, many of them, regardless of what their faith was, were forced to continue to work without any compensation. Following the treaty that ended the French and Indian War, Florida came under British rule. And it was the British who introduced the plantation version of slavery that many of us are familiar with to what became the United States. On the eve of the Revolutionary War, the population of Florida was roughly 1,000 white people and 3,000 Black slaves. It's important to note that the Spanish returned over the period from 1784 to 1821 and ruled this area during the American Revolution. And this allowed Spain to recapture some territory. When Florida became a state in 1845, roughly half of its population were Black slaves. The 1845 Florida Constitution ensured that emancipation of Black slaves would remain illegal, even giving the state the power to forbid the entrance of new free Blacks from other states. I think it's important to reflect on what the journey of these Black slaves looked like as they made their way from Africa to what we now call the United States. This was not a luxurious journey. Here we have a diagram of a slave ship, and it shows that it is packed to full capacity. The slaves are chained together for months at a time, forced to lie in their own feces and urine and the feces and urine of all the other passengers. Many slaves died during this journey. There were rats on these ships gnawing at their bodies. They were forced to remain chained to corpses and endure rodent infestation, and again, the feces and urine of all of the other passengers. You can just imagine how horrific and disgusting and awful that journey was from Africa to the United States. This is a advertisement that was depicting what would be a slave auction. And it describes what was going to be available at this auction. And these were Africans who had been kidnapped and forced to serve here in the United States as slaves. And this particular ad shows that this auction would feature 39 men, 15 boys, 24 women, and 16 girls. Families were forced to separate. Children were ripped from their mother's arms, and they were sold to whoever the buyer happened to be. In this particular ad, it indicates that these slaves had just arrived from Sierra Leone. This is a picture showing what some of these slave auctions look like. This drawing, this artwork shows a mother and presumably her daughter being auctioned. You see the potential slave owners inspecting them as property. And again, children were forcibly separated from their parents during slavery. Parents had no ability to control the destiny of their children. This is another picture showing an African man, a Black man, being inspected by a potential slave owner um, who was trying to decide if he was going to purchase this man. And you can just imagine how horrific that must have been to stand there and be physically inspected by someone so that you could be purchased and sold into slavery. And they would look at these human beings as property. And actually, our Constitution, the original version of our Constitution, did not consider Black people to be full human beings. Of course, we, under the language of that original Constitution, were only considered to be 3/5 of human beings. So now we're going back to our discussion of Juneteenth. What is Juneteenth? And again, it is when newly freed Black people learned on June 19th, 1865, that they were free. There was a celebration, as you might imagine, with food and singing of spirituals. They were happy that they no longer had to live as slaves. But as we will learn as we get further into this discussion, slavery really did not end. Even on Juneteenth, these Black slaves had no property, they had no money, they were given no reparations, even after hundreds of years of forced service to this country, and they had nowhere to go. So many of them were forced to go back to the very plantations where they had been enslaved. During the Civil War, the U.S. Congress passed the Confiscation Act of 1862, which authorized Union troops to seize Confederate property, and this included Black slaves. The act allowed the Union Army to recruit Black soldiers. Months later, as the nation approached its third year of the Civil War, President Lincoln, on January 1st, 1863, would affirm the aims of this act with the famous Emancipation Proclamation. And again, it's important to understand that Lincoln, through his Emancipation Proclamation, only freed slaves in the South. There were still slaves in the Union states, in the northern states, that were not free under this Emancipation Proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation freed millions of Black slaves in the Confederate States, but specifically exempted those in Union loyal border states such as Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. These states held Confederate sympathies, and Lincoln was worried that if he tried to free the Black slaves in these Union states, that they would leave the Union and he could potentially lose the war. So he had to allow them to stay with slavery and continue to have slavery. This is a picture showing some formerly enslaved people. They're preparing to celebrate Juneteenth after learning about their freedom. I think it's also important to take a moment to think about what life was like after these formerly enslaved Black people were emancipated. As historian Henry Louis Gates Jr. noted, freedom wasn't automatic for Texas's 250,000 enslaved people. Many masters decided when and how to announce the news. They continued to try to exploit the labor of these now free Black people who were not aware that they were free. And it's because they dragged this out that it was 2.5 years later before these Black people in Galveston, Texas learned about their freedom. The very first celebration of Juneteenth took place in 1866 in Texas. And as we mentioned earlier, there was food and singing and just an amazing celebration amongst people learning about their freedom. However, as we'll learn, it wasn't complete freedom for many of these people. I think it's also important to reflect on what was happening in the great state of California, my home state. I think many people have the misimpression that California has long been this progressive oasis, but it has not been that. Following the emancipation of slaves in the South and the end of slavery in the United States as we know it, there were many states following Reconstruction that enacted Jim Crow laws to prevent not only Black people, but people of color from being part of the society. And these are the type of signs that we see here on the screen that greeted Black people and other people of color in California following the end of slavery. We see here on this sign, it says no dogs, no Negroes, no Mexicans, colored served in rear. So that had to do with restaurants. If you wanted to get food from a restaurant, you couldn't walk in the front, you had to go in the back, hope they didn't spit in your food. Many restrooms in public buildings and places were for white folks only, and they of course had colored and white drinking fountains. California became a state in 1850. This was before the end of slavery. And the very first governor of California was Peter H. Burnett. He was a white supremacist, and it was his goal in during his tenure to do everything possible to limit the ability of Black people and other people of color from having any meaningful role in California. He aggressively pushed a number of Jim Crow laws in California that remained in effect for approximately 100 years, and some of them more than 100 years. Here's a summary of some of the Jim Crow laws that were in effect in California. And again, I emphasize this was California. I'm not talking about the Jim Crow laws in many places in the South, but this was California that had these Jim Crow laws. There were laws in the state of California that barred non-whites from testifying in any state where a white person was a party. And we're going to get into this a little bit more as the discussion continues. There were, and this didn't matter, by the way, if it was a criminal case or a civil case. It didn't matter if you had some minor interaction or accident with someone who happened to be white and you were a person of color. It didn't matter if you witnessed a murder. It didn't matter if you witnessed a rape. It didn't matter if you were raped or if your family member was murdered. If you were a person of color in California, you were prohibited from testifying against a white person. You couldn't call the police. You couldn't call the prosecutor. You couldn't ask for help from a judge. Nobody was going to help you if you were a person of color in California. There were Jim Crow laws in California that barred non-whites from serving on a jury. There were Jim Crow laws in California that barred non-whites from voting. There were Jim Crow laws in California that barred non-whites from holding elective office. We think about all of the great people of color that have served our country, our state, our cities as public servants. Well, in California, for approximately 100 years, that was illegal. Barred non-whites from serving as judges, barred non-white attorneys from questioning white witnesses. This is something that many people are unaware of. But in California, for decades, if you were a person who looked like me, if you were a person of color, you could not question a white witness, or more accurately, a white witness did not have to answer your questions if you happen to not be white. They could simply ignore you. So you can imagine how challenging that was as a lawyer to represent a client in a civil or criminal action if white witnesses could ignore your questions. Barred non-whites from public schools. We had discrimination in public schools in California, and I would argue that we still do. Many of our schools are racially segregated based on zip code. I went to a racially segregated school. It was predominantly Black and Hispanic. We had inferior textbooks. The books were decades old. I remember I had an AP history class that had textbooks that were more than 20 years old. Not all of the information that would be covered on the test was available to us in the textbook. I had to go to the public library to learn the information that was not available to us in school because it was so inferior. I remember we had a mandatory computer literacy course. This was at my high school in Inglewood. I went to Inglewood High School. There were no computers. We were given a photocopy of a keyboard, and we had a teacher who lectured on what would happen if we actually had a computer. It was pretty pathetic, but that was the experience, and that is the experience of many inner city minority students today in 2022, unfortunately. There were laws in California, Jim Crow laws, that barred non-whites from buying or renting property. This is redlining. We're going to talk a little bit more about this as we get further in this discussion, but there were Jim Crow laws in California that prohibited people of color from buying property or renting property in certain areas, redlining. You could not get a loan. There were covenants in the deeds of trust that allowed for the discrimination. And we go beyond this. Around the time that Prop 13 was passed in California, there was a Proposition 14, which sanctioned discrimination in public housing. And this was after the legislature and the governor had enacted law that prohibited discrimination. The great people of California voted overwhelmingly to overrule that action by the California legislature and the then governor to allow for this racial discrimination in housing. Ultimately, it was overturned by the Supreme Court, but that happened in California. There were laws in California that barred non-whites from being buried in certain cemeteries. The Inglewood Cemetery, where I have many of my loved ones buried, was initially a segregated cemetery and prohibited non-whites from being buried there. There was a fight that was led by a number of folks in California, in the city of Inglewood in particular, to desegregate cemeteries in California. There were laws in California that barred non-whites from restaurants, hotels, theaters, pools, hospitals, and beaches. Many people were surprised when they learned that there was segregation and discrimination when it came to hospitals in California, and this was true throughout the country. If you were a person of color and you had been in an accident, you needed immediate emergency medical attention, you had a heart attack, whatever the circumstance, you could not just go to any hospital that you wanted to. You could only go to a hospital that served people of color. And if that hospital happened to be very far away, you would die before you got there. And there are numerous stories of people, famous people, who died before they could get to a hospital that would treat someone who was a person of color. There were laws in California that denied admission to non-whites to bar associations. Some people wonder, why do we have so many bar associations for people of different ethnicities, or members of the LGBTQ community? Well, specifically as it relates to race, we have Black bar associations. We have Asian API bar associations. We have Hispanic Latinx bar associations, Native American bar associations. We have these bar associations because they were denied, people of color were denied admission to predominantly white bar associations. You couldn't just join a city bar association or state bar association. if you were a person of color. The only option you had was to become part of a minority bar association, which is why they still exist today. There were laws in California that barred non-whites from public transportation. If you were a person who looked like me or any other person of color, you could not just take public transportation. And that was the case in California, not just places in the South. Prohibited whites from marrying non-whites. These were miscegenation laws. We're familiar, of course, with the Loving versus Virginia case. Well, we had laws like that here in California, and it's also important to understand that the laws prohibited white people from marrying people of color. There were no laws that prohibited people of color from mixing with each other. And the rationale behind those laws was this fear of replacement. And we hear now conversations about replacement theory. Well, it dates back many decades, going back to these miscegenation laws. There was fear that if white people mixed with people of color, that their numbers would become diluted. So that's why white people specifically were prohibited from mixing with people of color. There was no concern at all amongst white people about people of color mixing amongst themselves. This takes us to an important case. This is a California Supreme Court case that really highlights the institutional racism that we had here in California. This case, it's called the People versus Hall. And in this case, we had a white man who had been convicted of murdering a Chinese man in California in the presence of multiple Chinese witnesses. So there was no question that this particular white man had murdered this particular Chinese man. Numerous Chinese witnesses. The issue that was before the court is, were these witnesses going to be deemed competent to testify? So at issue was Section 394 of the California Civil Practice Act, which provided no Indian or Negro shall be allowed to testify as a witness in any action in which a white person is a party. And so the court struggled with whether or not Asian people would be characterized as Indian or Negro or white. In other words, would the court confer white privilege on Asian people? Would they treat Asian people like white people, or would they treat Asian people like Black people? Ultimately, the California Supreme Court held that the words Indian, Negro, Black, and white are generic terms designating race. That therefore, Chinese and all other people not white are included in the prohibition from being witnesses against whites. In other words, the California Supreme Court said, we are going to treat Asian people like Black people. Black is a catch-all phrase for everybody who's not white. Asian people, under this decision, were not given white privilege. So what is the practical result of this? Is that the white man who had murdered an Asian man and had been witnessed by numerous Asian people to have committed this murder was able to go away for free. He was able to get off for free because all of the Asian folks were deemed incompetent and they were prohibited from testifying against the white man. So this essentially allowed white people during this period to do whatever they wanted to people of color. They could kill them, rape them, rob them, whatever. The people of color could not go to the police because they could not testify. That included talking to police officers, couldn't testify against them, couldn't get any help from police, couldn't sue them. They just had to deal with it. Another interesting case decided by the California Supreme Court, the People versus Elia, 14 Cal 144. This was another criminal case whereby a white defendant was appealing a first-degree murder conviction. And so the issue in this case was whether a Turkish witness who had dark skin but Caucasian features was competent to testify against the white criminal defendant under Section 394, which we just talked about. So the California Supreme Court wrestled with this issue, right? You have white folks who like to go to the beach, get a nice suntan, get a little bit of color. Will they lose their white privilege because the shade of their skin has gotten darker? If you get a really nice suntan, I was born with one, but if you go to the beach to get your suntan, will you lose your white privilege? To make a long story short, the California Supreme Court decided that if you go to a beach and you get a nice suntan, you're not going to lose your white privilege. If you have Caucasian features and you happen to be darker skinned, you still have white privilege, and there's no need to hide from the sun. There's no need to avoid beaches. There's no need to avoid, tanning salons, which I don't think existed at the time. You won't lose your white privilege. But if you happen to be a light-skinned Black person, or a light-skinned Asian person, or a light-skinned Hispanic person who does not have Caucasian features, you don't get white privilege. So it doesn't work both ways. It's only if you have Caucasian features. That is the most important thing to this particular California Supreme Court. That is the most important thing for keeping your white privilege. So the holding here, if a witness has dark skin but Caucasian features, they're competent to testify in an action where a white person is a witness. This now leads us into the second half of our discussion, reparations. As we mentioned earlier, there were no reparations paid to these slaves, these enslaved Black people, once they were free from slavery, or theoretically free from slavery. Reparations is not a foreign concept. The United States has paid reparations numerous times. The United States has paid billions of dollars in reparations to Native Americans. Now, this by no means suggests that all Native Americans have received fair and just compensation from the United States government for all the atrocities and tragedies that they've experienced at the hands of the US government. That has not happened. But yet, there have been billions of dollars in reparations paid to some Native Americans, not all. There's still many, many Native Americans who have not received anything from the US government in the way of reparations. The US government paid $1.5 billion to Japanese Americans because of how they were treated during World War II. We, of course, had those the camps where where the U.S. government mistreated members of the Asian community, many who weren't even Japanese, but paid specifically $1.5 billion. Additionally, the United States, through the Marshall Plan, helped to ensure that Jews received reparations for the Holocaust, including making various investments over time. In 1952, for example, West Germany agreed to pay $3.45 billion, or 3.45 billion Deutsche Marks to Holocaust survivors. So this notion of reparations is not foreign. The United States has paid reparations to folks many times. Unfortunately, however, our federal government, and by and large our state governments, has never paid reparations to Black people. Never. About 15% of the enslaved Black folks died during transport. Black people, as we mentioned, worked as slaves for nearly well over 300 years, going from 1539 to 1865, in some cases beyond. It's never paid anything in reparations to these formerly enslaved Black people. There was this concept, this idea that President Lincoln was considering, 40 acres and a mule, and this is something that has come up many times in popular culture. 40 acres and a mule And this was the first major opportunity that the United States had where it would provide some compensation to the formerly enslaved. Obviously, you can never fully compensate people for 300 years of free labor that built this country. Many of their forefathers are dead. All of the generational wealth that was lost as a result of not being able to own property and pass down property and being forced to give free labor. So you can never replace all of that. But there was this concept of 40 acres and a mule as providing compensation for some of the freed slaves. Unfortunately, one of the consequences of President Lincoln's assassination is that this field order, which was going to provide this compensation to slaves, never took effect. And part of the reason why is Andrew Johnson, who was a Southern sympathizer, was a vehement racist. He hated Black people. And instead of giving any reparations to the Black people who had been enslaved, he ordered the federal government to give reparations to the former slave owners, saying that they had lost their property as a result of the Civil War. And so he gave to the slave owners reparations instead of to the formerly enslaved. For example, in Washington, D.C., slave owners were actually paid reparations for lost property, the formerly enslaved. This practice was also common in nearby states. The other sad reality of slavery is that many Black Americans were forced to work as sharecroppers. This included members of my family, my grandparents, and my great-grandparents. You can imagine, after 300 plus years of providing free labor to the white community, you don't own any property, you don't have any money, you don't have any, any personal property, any vehicles, nothing. No horses, you don't own anything. And you're just kind of thrown out there and said, okay, well, now you're free. Well, where do you go? How do you make a living? Many of the slaves were not educated because there were laws that prohibited slaves from learning how to read. Some of them still taught themselves and still learned in spite of this, but they had nothing. So many of them were forced to return to the same farms and plantations where they had worked as slaves to work as sharecroppers, which was really another form of slavery. And this continued for about 100 years after slavery. So when folks say that slavery ended and we celebrated Juneteenth in 1866, it didn't really end then. It continued for another 100 years as sharecropping. And under sharecropping, you had Black folks who were working for pennies. There was no minimum wage. They were loaded up with all types of expenses related to the plantation. And it was almost like an indentured servitude. They couldn't leave because they had so much debt that was forced on them, and they could never earn enough money to escape. So it was essentially another type of slavery. This takes us to the Homestead Act. The greatest generator of wealth in American history was the Homestead Act. It was enacted during the Civil War in 1862, took effect January 1st, 1863, and under the Homestead Act, 160 acres of unappropriated public lands was given to any white person who paid a very tiny fee and agreed to work the land to improve it, including by building a residence there over a 5-year period. Millions and millions of acres of land was given under the Homestead Act, 270 million to be exact, and 99% of it was given to white people. This is why we have such a great wealth disparity in this country between white Americans and Black Americans and other communities of color. This isn't to say that all white people are rich or all white people benefited from the Homestead Act, but one of the reasons why we have such a huge disparity in wealth is because of the generational wealth that was passed down as a result of millions and millions of white people taking advantage of the Homestead Act. We actually had millions of Europeans that moved to the United States to take advantage of the Homestead Act. So you can imagine how frustrating and insulting that was to have millions of Black slaves who worked for free for over 300 years to build this country, and they were denied the opportunity to take advantage of the act in their own country. And white people from Europe were given priority over them, so much so that 99% of all of the benefits went to white people. This takes us to the New Deal. Many folks are aware of the New Deal. It was a safety net that was part of an effort to rescue the United States from the Great Depression. There were a number of components to the New Deal, including the GI Bill and Social Security. And even though you had Black people fighting right next to white people, and in many cases on the front lines in World War II, they were denied the opportunity to take advantage of these New Deal programs. Even though it was federally mandated, it was implemented locally, which allowed many jurisdictions with Jim Crow laws to specifically prohibit Black people from taking advantage of the benefits. So the GI Bill did not specifically exclude African Americans, but it was structured in a way to deny African Americans, Black folks, other people of color from taking advantage of it. Focusing specifically on the Black community, you had 1.2 million Black veterans from World War II, 1.2 million, but they were denied the benefits of the GI Bill. What were some of these benefits? College tuition for veterans and their children, small business grants, low-cost home loans guaranteed by the US government, and unemployment insurance. So let's think for 1 minute as we look at the wealth gap between Black people and white people, or people of color and white people, but specifically Black people and white people. For those 1.2 million Black veterans who fought bravely to defend our freedom in World War II, if they had been given the opportunity to get college education paid for by the US government, for their children to get college education paid for the US government, to have money guaranteed by the US government for low-cost home loans, and to start businesses and unemployment insurance, where would the Black community be today if we had been given the same opportunity after putting our lives on the line for this country? Where would we be? Would we have such a huge wealth gap? No, things would be different if we had just been given the same opportunity, but we weren't. Same thing went to Social Security, which is the safety net for millions upon millions of elderly Americans. Black people were excluded from Social Security. Again, it was structured in a way where 60% of Black folks across the United States and 70% of Black folks in Southern states who worked in these specific domestic and farm worker occupations were excluded from the benefits of Social Security. When we think about it, it's really amazing that Black people have been able to persevere and survive considering everything that they have been denied and had to deal with. Not only did they have to endure 300 plus years of slavery, we had to endure 300 plus years of slavery. Then we had about 100 plus years of Jim Crow laws, then denied and completely left out of the greatest generator of wealth in American history, the Homestead Act, and then excluded 1.2 million veterans excluded from the GI Bill. And then millions upon millions of Black folks denied the opportunity to take advantage of Social Security. This now leads us to a discussion about Black massacres. There were millions of Black people who, in spite of slavery, in spite of being denied the opportunity to participate in the Homestead Act and denied the opportunity to participate in the benefits of the GI Bill and Social Security, they still built successful Black neighborhoods with Black churches and stores and hospitals and law offices. And they were living their best lives. But we had more than 30 massacres in the United States where white people burned these successful towns down to the ground, and there was nothing the Black people could do about it. Because in these states, just like we talked about in California, there were laws that prohibited Black people from testifying against white people. There were laws that prohibited Black people from suing white people or calling the police on white people. So there was nothing they could do but endure it. And to add insult to injury, after their towns were destroyed and burned down, in many circumstances, white people took these towns over and took the property for themselves. Many of us are familiar with the Tulsa Massacre of 1921, but it doesn't stop there. Blacks were also massacred by whites in Chicago in 1919. Black folks were massacred by whites in Springfield in 1910. Black folks were massacred by whites in East St. Louis in 1917. Black folks were massacred by whites in Vicksburg in 1874. Black folks were massacred by whites in Slocum in 1910. Black folks were massacred by whites in Colfax in 1873. Black folks were massacred by whites in Opelousas in 1868. Black folks were massacred by whites in Thibodaux in 1887. But it didn't stop there. Black folks were massacred by whites. In Memphis in 1866, Black folks were massacred by whites. In Elaine in 1919, Black folks were massacred by whites. In Clinton in 1875, Black folks were massacred by whites. In Rosewood in 1923, Black folks were massacred by whites. In St. Bernard Parish in 1868, Black folks were massacred by whites. In New Orleans in 1866, Black folks were massacred by whites. In Detroit in 1943, Black folks were massacred by whites. In Washington in 1919, but it didn't stop there. Black folks were also massacred by whites in Wilmington in 1898, and Black folks were massacred by whites in Atlanta in 1906, and Black folks were massacred by whites, should be 1863 in New York. Black folks were massacred by whites in Ufalua in 1874. Black folks were massacred by whites in Camila in 1868. Black folks were massacred by whites in Okosi in 1920. All of these massacres were everything that the Black community had in all of these different cities, their houses, their hospitals, their stores, their churches, their places of business, completely, totally burned to the ground, destroyed, and there was no recourse for them. This also happened in the great state of California. In the written materials that I've prepared, I talk about the downfall of Allensworth. It was a Black town in California that was destroyed by racism. Ultimately, government actors, along with private individuals, drove out this very successful group of Black people who had been there for decades, again, with their own homes and stores and businesses and churches and everything, turned off the water supply, cut off resources, and forced these Black people to evacuate their home of decades. It was just devastating what happened. And then the land that they had was taken over by people who enacted Jim Crow laws. We talk a lot about Rosa Parks and her bravery in helping to desegregate public transportation during the bus boycott. But Rosa Parks was not the first Black woman who fought for desegregation of public transportation. The first Black woman that at least I'm aware of was the great Charlotte L. Brown, who seems to have been forgotten in history, who in 1863 fought to desegregate public transportation in San Francisco. And this is a picture of the beautiful Charlotte L. Brown. She's sitting here, 1863. This is the streetcar, similar to what she rode in. She was from a prominent Black family in San Francisco. She refused a conductor's demand to remove herself from a streetcar because Black people, colored persons, it didn't matter if you were Hispanic, Asian, Native American, Black, Hispanic folks, it didn't matter. Everybody who was not white were not allowed to ride on public transportation. So nearly 100 years before the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott in 1954, this was in 1863, April 17th, 1863. San Francisco had the largest Black population in the state of California. It was the era of the gold rush. Miss Charlotte Brown had a doctor's appointment, and the fastest way for her to get there was to use the railroad streetcar. And she was determined to make this appointment. So she decided she was going to take this streetcar. They tried to force her out of the car. She was arrested. And remember, this was during the time where it was illegal for Black people to testify against white folks. You couldn't sue white folks. You couldn't get the police on white. You couldn't do anything. But she fought this in San Francisco. This was in Superior Court. And she won. This was kind of an anomaly, considering how racist the court system was during this particular time. The judge sided with Brown, but said her damage award was only 5 cents, the cost of her street fare. Just a few days later, after winning this, she and her father were forced from another streetcar. She brought another lawsuit. And this went to the 12th District Court, which ruled that San Francisco streetcar segregation was illegal. This time, she was awarded $500. And this was before, there was any 14th Amendment to provide support for her claims. It was a powerful statement for civil rights, nearly 100 years before Rosa Parks. So I think it's important that we take a moment to honor the San Francisco civil rights leader of 1863, the great Charlotte Brown. I also want to take a moment to talk about discrimination against members of the Hispanic Latinx community in Los Angeles. This is a part of Los Angeles history that has been lost to many people. And it shows that this mistreatment of people of color was not limited to Black people. It happened to Asian people, Native American people, Latinx, Hispanic people. And this is the battle over Chavez Ravine. So back in the 1950s, when the Dodgers were looking for land to build what is now Dodger Stadium, they wanted to find the least expensive land they could. And ultimately, they decided on this part of Los Angeles known as Chavez Ravine. And so they worked with city government to use eminent domain to force these people, who were mostly Latinx Hispanic, there were some Black folks there, off of this land so that they could bulldoze it and they could build what is now Dodger Stadium. And these individuals, these families that had been there for generations, they never got compensation for the loss of their homes. Many of these folks had been forced to live in Chavez Ravine because of redlining, so they were prohibited from living in many other parts of the city. So this is where they made their homes and raised their families for generations. But the Dodgers, along with members of Los Angeles city government and law enforcement decided that they needed to remove these people. So they offered them scraps for their homes. Many people refused. It was far below market. It was far below fair market value. And they decided they were going to stay and fight because they didn't want to take these pennies that they were being offered for homes that had been in their family for generations, homes that they had worked so hard for. So they said, we're not taking it. We're going to stay here and fight. And when they refused to take these scraps, they were forced from their homes. And again, this was during a time where there were numerous restrictions on the ability of people of color to fight in court against white people. There were some lawyers who tried to come to the aid of these, Hispanic and Black residents, mostly Hispanic, but they were not successful. So in this picture here, we see Aurora Vargas being evicted from her home in Chavez Lavine, Los Angeles, California. She had said she was not leaving her home. She was not going to take the scraps that was offered to her. And so the city sent law enforcement in and they dragged her out of her home. This is another picture of Aurora Vargas. This was May 8th, 1959. And she was among several Chavez Ravine residents who fought eviction, said that they were not going to leave and they were going to have to take her out because she was not going to go willingly. You can see them here dragging her out of her home. Right behind her, right here, is her daughter and the rest of her family members, and they were physically dragged out of their home May 8th, 1959, and then the city sent bulldozers in and bulldozed their home. This is what Chavez Ravine looked like, and I know it's black and white, but this is from the 1950s. And this is what Chavez Ravine looked like before it was bulldozed so that Dodger Stadium could be constructed, okay? This is another picture of Miss Aurora Vargas, who was 36 at the time, being forcibly evicted from her home at 1771 Malvina Avenue in Chavez Ravine. She and her family and other members of the Latinx Hispanic community, Black community, they fought, but they were forced out again by law enforcement. They did everything they could to hold on to their property that they had given their whole lives for, but sadly, they were not successful. Interesting personal fact, my father is not a fan of the Dodgers. I'm actually not a Dodgers fan, I'm a Giants fan. But the reason why he's not a Dodgers fan, I'm not a Dodgers fan, is because we had family members that lost their homes in Chavez Ravine and never received fair compensation from the Dodgers or the city of Los Angeles. And so it's that frustration that has made us not support the Dodgers, and we support the Giants. The Giants did not evict people of color from their homes to build their stadium. They actually turned a landfill into their stadium. So another fun fact. This is a picture of a beautiful Latinx Hispanic family in front of their home. This was in 1951. This is the Navarro family. And this was before this particular family was relocated from their home, and they were relocated to a housing project, but beautiful family. And this here is a picture of May 11th, 1959. It shows Cruz Cabral, 39. He was an ex-Marine war hero from World War II. This kind of goes back to the discussion that we had about the GI benefits denied to Black people. It was also denied to Hispanic people and Asian people. Where was the GI Bill for him and his family so that he could get a loan guaranteed by the US government so he could get a nice home for his family? Where was it when this tragedy was happening in Chavez Ravine? He was not given that opportunity. So it shows Mr. Cruz Cabral with his aunt, um, Abrana Archiega, who was 72 at the time, and she is showing off his war medals. He was wounded 4 times in the South Pacific in World War II, fighting for this country. And they're holding up a sign, "This is what we fought for." So he put his life on the line. He was wounded 4 times, protecting the freedom of the United States of America. But because he was a Hispanic man, he was not given the benefit of the GI Bill. And to add insult to injury, he was forced out of his home. And you see behind him the ruins of his bulldozed home, taken without just compensation. This is a picture here, May 14, 1959. It shows Mrs. Abrana Archiega left and her daughter, Miss Vicky Augustine, on the right. And they're looking at their home in Chavez Ravine, which was destroyed by bulldozers during this controversial eviction that had taken place. And so they were forced to live in a tent after their home was bulldozed. And again, this family never, ever received just compensation. And my prayer to the city of Los Angeles and the wonderful LA Dodgers, a wonderful team. You've made millions, billions of dollars since the construction of Dodger Stadium. Why not pay reparations to all of these Hispanic and Black families who lost everything when their homes were unjustly bulldozed in Chavez Ravine? Why not compensate these families? I think it's the right thing to do. This here is a picture taken February 16, 1961. You see ramparts rise at the top. And basically, this is the construction of Dodger Stadium on the very site of Chavez Ravine, where all of these Hispanic families lost everything they own. All these Black families lost everything they own and never received compensation. February 16, 1961. This is opening day, April 10th, 1962, Dodger Stadium, beautiful stadium, seats 56,000 people. This is on a site where thousands of mostly Latinx Hispanic families called home. And I just want to go back to that picture. This is the same site where you see this picture here, this panoramic view, where you have thousands of families, mostly Hispanic and Black. This is their homes. This is where they lived for generations. Their hard-earned money built these neighborhoods. And this whole area that you see in this picture was bulldozed for the construction of Dodger Stadium. So these families were completely displaced, devastated, had their lives turned upside down, and never in their lifetimes received just compensation for the construction of Dodger Stadium. My hope is that the state of California, the city of Los Angeles, and the Dodgers will right this historic wrong and restore to these families the compensation that they deserve for losing their homes. This brings us to the end of our discussion about Juneteenth and slavery and reparations and systemic racism and all of those amazing topics. I'm going to create some other videos that will be part of this series, but I just really wanted to enlighten people so they would understand the history that preceded and the history that followed Juneteenth. As we celebrate the end of slavery, let's also be conscious about the systemic racism that continued to oppress not only Black people, but other people of color following the end of slavery. We still have a lot of work to do. This whole discussion that we had in this video is illegal in more than 30 states. Approximately 34 states have critical race theory laws that ban the discussion of our true history, of our painful history, of the oppression of people of color, of the oppression of members of the LGBTQ community, of the oppression of women. It's an important part of our history. And we really cannot understand how to move forward if we don't understand the past. We really cannot understand the disparities that we have between various communities of color if we don't understand the advantages that other communities had at the expense of communities of color. And that's really what the purpose of this video is to help elucidate that. Again, I will have additional videos in this series. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Please like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And please support the free flowing of information and education about the true history of our great country. This has been Terrance J. Evans. Thank you for joining me for this educational experience. Have a happy Juneteenth, everyone. Thank you very much.